main aim of this book is to articulate a novel metaphysical framework, which I characterize as a fractured immanent one. This framework emerges as a response to a transcendental investigation into the possibility of thinking about the world while being situated within a world that we did not create. In other words, the fundamental problematic out of which our metaphysical framework emerges as a response is the issue of how thinking can be in the world while simultaneously being about the world. Insofar as thinking is about the world, in the sense of being directed toward the world in a way that makes it rationally responsive and answerable to the world, it cannot be in the world as one of its parts, but must stand against it as a standard of measurement, as it were, of measuring and being measured by the world. Yet, at the same time, thinking cannot be about the world unless it is somehow within it. If this were not so, it would be hard to see how it is so much as possible for thinking to be about this world which we did not create, and which materially supports and undermines our continuing bodily and mental existence. Thus, ultimately, the task is to understand how thinking can be both inside and outside the world. As was mentioned above, this issue is approached from a decidedly metaphysical point of view, which yet, hopefully, avoids being naively pre-critical, in that it is actually the result of the above kind of an essentially transcendental investigation of the conditions that enable thinking to be simultaneously a material process within the world and something intentionally directed toward and answerable to the world. In particular, I attempt to understand how the natural world and our relation to it can appear in two conflicting ways to ourselves. On the one hand, it seems rather uncontroversial, at least from modernity onward, to say that human minds are ontologically immanent to nature. Our minds and their distinctive characteristics, normativity, freedom, conceptually articulated thought, are not a kingdom within a kingdom, separate ontological regions within the world. They are part of nature. They are ontologically within it, dependent on it, and whatever their distinctive and emergent character consists in, it is not such as to exert any kind of transcendent causality to nature, including our bodies. On the other hand, this very natural world, precisely in its immanent expression as mind, appears as always already correlated with the categories of mind, our categorial perspective, or even as projected in the form of mutually incompatible categorial perspectives of ourselves in the world, normativist, causal, naturalistic, and according to the normativist self-image, we are essentially normatively individuated persons whose perception, thinking, and action are intentionally directed and rationally responsive to external reality, while according to the causal naturalistic self-image inspired by growing scientific achievements, we are essentially non-normatively individuated, complex physical systems which are non-rationally, that is, only causally or lawfully, connected to other complex physical systems. Thus, it seems that the immanence of mind to the world is such that it can change its own topological orientation or direction of fit and turns the world to revolve immanently around the mind, where the conditions of possibility of the experience of objects are conditions of possibility of the objects of experience. How must the unconditionally existing natural world be related to the conditionally existing mind so as to immanently appear as always already correlated to the latter? By unconditional existence, I mean a manner of existence that is self-sufficient, that does not itself depend on something other than exists itself for existence. while conditional existence is a way of existence that is not self-sufficient and depends on something other than itself for existence. And how can this mind-world correlation take the form of mutually incompatible perspectives, causal versus normative, of one and the same underlying world which both these perspectives somehow express? I shall argue that this very general metaphysical question as to the nature of this asymmetrically immanent relation between mind and world, which appears in essentially perspectival form, can be illuminated by introducing and developing the concept and the corresponding metaphysics and epistemology of fractured immanence. On the metaphysical side, this viewpoint leads to a resolute acceptance of the univocity of being inspired by Deleuze and to a process ontology inspired by Sellers, Peirce, and Deleuze, while on the epistemological side, it commits us to a resolute rejection of the myth of the given inspired by Sellers. Specifically, it will be argued that a univocal process ontology which eschews both normative and causal categories, provides a platform for ontologically integrating these two equally indispensable viewpoints of the relation between thinking and being, namely, thinking and being as normatively correlated, commonsensical understanding of mind and world, and as non-normatively correlated, causal, naturalistic understanding of mind and world. At the same time, the process framework provides more fundamental and explanatory scope. In it can also give a process evolutionary account for the nature, utility, and limits of the respective commonsensical and natural scientific mind-world correlations involved. In this way, both the indispensability and the incommensurability between the reasons and causes framework are explained in practical and ultimately evolutionary terms as indispensable tools for navigating the phenomenal world of the ordinary life world. By being accounted for in this manner, the indispensability and the incommensurability between reasons and causes cease to appear as unexplained brute facts. Indeed, it will turn out that these viewpoints are complementary, and, in the context of a fractured immanent metaphysics, they can even be integrated into a single, though essentially fractured, immanent process vision of ourselves in the world. From this metaphysical standpoint, mind is immanent to nature, but this immanence is essentially fractured. What is most proximal in the order of being, our own experience of ourselves in the world, is most distant in the order of understanding. What is immanent is not the identity nor the difference as such between mind and world, but the ontological identity cum logical difference between them. The book defends and explores this peculiar kind of immanent relation between mind and world, and argues that it results once we resolutely reject the myth of the given, Sellers, namely, the view that the relation between mind and world is experientially, intuitively, phenomenologically, or categorically transparent to the mind. It is precisely because it comes with a resolute rejection of givenness in all its forms that the mind-world immanence is essentially fractured. Yet, this does not mean that thought fails to reach into the world as such, as if it is destined to be about something less than it. For example, the phenomenal world, or the world as always already correlated to the categories, experience, individual, historical, socio-political perspective, etc. Rather, it means that thought's conception of the world as it is in itself is not itself given and is always subject to self-correction. In this connection, I attempt to draw the implications of a resolute rejection of givenness not only in epistemology but also in semantics and ontology. The most important of them are that a rejection of the given entails an anti-representationalism in semantics and ontology, and b. a post-Kantian critical and transcendentally informed process metaphysics. It is precisely from this radically anti-givenist, non-traditional metaphysical standpoint, which proves to be at once non-representational, transcendental, and critical, that the proposed process ontological framework can successfully account for both the normative and the causal naturalistic dimension of our understanding of the relation between mind and world without reproducing the reifications and dogmatism of old-school pre-Kantian metaphysics, and without presupposing an impossible epistemic God's eye view from which the totality of possible worlds or conceptual frameworks can be antecedently surveyed. Lastly, as will be shown in the overview, fractured immanence is not just a metaphysical diagnosis of the mind-world relation, but a proposal for rethinking grounding, emergence, normativity, and freedom in a processual register, bypassing both substance metaphysics and semantic representationalism. 1.1 Overview. The overall argument of the book is developed in 9 chapters. In Chapter 2, I provide a clarification of the concept of immanence. I distinguish between different kinds of immanence. I clarify the precise sense in which I use this term, and I provide a rationale for considering immanence a central concept for the development of a resolutely non-dualist or non-epiphenomenalist ontology, which accounts for the creative evolution of being without introducing transcendent causes or reasons for understanding it. Immanence is the view that there is no transcendent ground, cause, or viewpoint that explains the existence of the world, or the mind-world correlation. There are different conceptions of immanence depending on what kind of transcendence is to be rejected, ontological, epistemological, explanatory, and on what is taken as an immanently primary, that is, unconditional, unexplained explainer. The first part refers to a formal conception or formal conceptions of immanence, while Group 2, the latter portion, refers to a substantial conception or substantial conceptions of immanence. Regarding the latter, think for example of Hegel's thought being immanence, or Husserl's phenomenological immanence, revealed through the transcendental bracketing of the natural attitude. I clarify that my substantial conception of immanence takes being to be unconditional. Being's existence is not conditional upon a transcendental metaphysical ground, e.g. God, nothingness, space-time, laws of nature, nor is it upon a transcendental consciousness and the special kind of openness to the world that makes possible through the categorical or existential structures of the transcendental subject. I also highlight how I understand immanence in relation to thinking. Thinking about the world is immanent in that it necessarily unfolds and self-corrects in media res, in the midst of our practices, thus rejecting the view from nowhere conception of thought. Chapter 3 elaborates this further. What does it mean for thinking to reject the view from nowhere and to embrace its in media res and self-correcting character? I argue that the key point here is that the resolute rejection of the myth of the given, qua Sellers, indeed, it is suggested that immanence can provide an illuminating account of the relation between mind and world only if it goes hand in hand with a complete rejection of the given. See Brasier. From this anti-givenist point of view, what is immanent is the identity necessarily presented as difference between thought and world. Thought is immanent to being, but this immanence is essentially fractured. I also explore the consequences of resolutely rejecting the given for ontology and the nature of our access to the world through thought. I argue that the rejection of givenness implies that, at the level of semantics, thinking attempts to grasp the world as such. There are no fixed limits to thinking, for example, transcendental conditions of possibility of experience, that prevent it from being semantically about the world as it is in itself. Yet it also implies that the form or content of the world as such are never themselves given to thinking in its semantic dimension and are always subject to self-correction. In this connection, I also focus on the anti-representational implications of the rejection of givenness in our conception of the mind-world relation. It is argued that a resolute rejection of givenness entails anti-representationalism in semantics and ontology, and a post-Kantian, critical, and transcendentally informed metaphysics. In this spirit, it is suggested that a Sellers-inspired non-representational semantics coupled with a Deleuze-inspired non-representationalist ontology can provide a viewpoint from which we can launch a positive critique of traditional representationalist substance property metaphysics by constructing an evolutionarily process metaphysics with anti-representationalist yet realist implications. From this standpoint, the realist view that there is no semantic, epistemic, transcendental barrier in thinking being about the world as it is in itself is rehabilitated, but is given an important twist. There is indeed no such barrier provided that this direct access of thinking to being in the semantic sense of the term, in which conceptual thinking is intentionally directed to the world tout court, is itself understood as an expression of a non-semantic, non-representational, direct relation between mind and world. Ultimately, the semantic aboutness of thought to a common, public, objective world through reference relations is revealed as an indispensable yet non-representationally functioning tool for collectively coordinating thought, considered as natural process to the world, considered as natural process where the relation between them at this level is not referential, logical, or causal. Rather, it is a non-semantic expressive relation of resonance, as in Deleuze, or picturing, as in Sellers, between dynamically co-evolving environmental, bodily, and brain processes whose degree of adequacy is measured by the degree of empowerment expressed in the collective cognitive processes involved. Interestingly, certain problematically givenness positions about the relation between mind and world, such as direct realism, according to which in favorable circumstances, conceptually articulated perceptual capacities give us direct access to the world as it is in itself, and transcendental phenomenology, according to which we have access to the correlation between mind and world, can be understood as expressions of the failure to draw this distinction between two radically different ways in which thinking can be said to have direct access to the world as it is in itself. In Chapter 4, based on Christias and inspired by Sellers and Deleuze, I suggest that a process-oriented categorical framework can provide the most promising successor of the substance property categorical framework at work in our everyday life world. The former is what results from an immanent critique of the latter. Moreover, I attempt to show that if a process ontology is to supersede the substance property ontological framework in a consistent manner, it must endorse a nominalistic metaphysics which eschews all kinds of abstract universals such as substances, properties, relations, kinds, facts, and construct a nominalist process language without recourse to Fregean contents or predicates as referring expressions. Chapter 5 further investigates important ontological implications of process ontology and attempts to find a place for emergence within a univocal process nominalist framework. Emergence in this context is understood as a self-fracturing of being. The account on offer, whether it involves the emergence of qualia of sensory and affective experience or the emergence of symbolic thinking, must be such as to avoid the nearly inevitable epiphenomenalist implications of non-reductive naturalism or an appeal to non-explanatory relations of supervenience between ontological levels, as in Heil and Kim. Having shown that experiential qualities can be emergent yet non-epiphenomenal only if we switch from a substance property metaphysics into a monistic process framework, I here examine whether and in what sense process nominalism can account for levels emergence. On the face of it, strict nominalism seems to allow only the emergence of non-universal structures and properties based on combinations of finite stock of actual basic particulars. How can these limited resources account for emergence and novelty? Here I use Deleuze's notion of intensity, stressing its topological properties as a way of developing a non-traditional, intensive processual nominalism, which can account for emergent levels of being in a nominalistically kosher way. In this connection, I highlight an important implication of this view about physicalism and panpsychism. Both physicalism and panpsychism are reductive positions that rightly reject overly simplistic, e.g. non-reductive physicalist, supervenience-based accounts of emergence, while wrongly concluding that this amounts to a rejection of emergence tout court. My suggestion here is that this is because both physicalism and panpsychism are blind to the possibility of emerging discontinuity from underlying continuity, e.g. the emergence of discontinuous actual levels from topologically continuous deformations or bifurcations of intensive processes. The philosophical cash value of the novel ontological modal process framework developed in this book is also tested by utilizing its basic principles to solve core problems in contemporary analytic metaphysics of powers. In Chapter 6, based on a Sellers, Peirce, and Deleuze-inspired evolutionary rendering of the principle of sufficient reason, I provide a novel account of grounding which questions background assumptions about the form of explanation that ontological grounds must offer to count as such, shared by contemporary neo-Humeans, neo-Aristotelian realists, and analytic neo-Hegelian absolute idealists. In Chapter 7, I turn my attention to the issue of the seeming incommensurability between two equally indispensable ways of understanding ourselves in the world: our normativist self-image, space of reasons, and intelligibility, or the intelligibility of the space of reasons, and our causal naturalistic self-image, space of causes, intelligibility. My suggestion is that both these frameworks are best understood as fractured projections of processual reality. To this end, I first stress the irreducibility, isolation, yet also parallelism of the space of reasons, norms, and the space of causes, facts, and suggest that these relations as a package deal are an essential part of a metaphysical view, itself a sophistication of our common sense view of the world after modernity that Brandom calls bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism. According to this view, which Brandom attributes to Hegel, the world is literally conceptually articulated and is bifurcated into two different yet deeply isomorphic modal orders: the alethic order, namely the causal realm of worldly objects, their properties and nomological relations, and the deontic normative order, the realm of reasoned thought as articulated by our norm-governed practices. I then propose that Brandom's conceptual realism and modal realism that articulate our ordinary descriptive metaphysics about reasons, causes, and their relations can be understood as indispensable latter languages that can yet be eventually transcended by a naturalistic process metaphysics where both causes and reasons are understood as different ways of being processes. Chapter 8 takes up the challenge of articulating a successor concept for normativity that construes the causal efficacy of the latter in a resolutely immanent naturalistic manner, yet without reducing it to mere physicalism. I mobilized Nick Land's notion of hyperstition as a successor concept and draw a picture of normativity as an emergent intensive regime which, by the way of we attitudes as its manner of causally affecting the world, institutes a novel kind of hyperstitional dynamics which can turn lies into truths. Hyperstitions are cybernetically functioning sign-making practices, typically expressing ideas, speculations, or narratives able to bring about their own reality through the workings of positive feedback loops, generating new sociolinguistic, economic, psychological attractors. Stock market speculation in capitalism is a prime example of hyperstitional feedback circles. The gradual entrenchment of Judeo-Christianity through trust in the truth of Gospels is another. It is important here to stress that as I see it, hyperstitional phenomena are not limited to the cultural sphere, but also find application to the workings of non-conceptual systems of organisms, and even to the inorganic realm as a result of an evolutionarily entrenched variety of iterative, repetitive, recursive replicating processes. This is a way of illustrating and developing my basic immanent materialist view of normativity, according to which its causal power lies exclusively in the enactment of normative statuses in the corresponding we attitudes. In this connection, I note an unexpected convergence of viewpoints with a conception of normativity articulated in Sellers, according to which norms are embodied generalizations which tend to make themselves true by inhibiting the occurrence of the events that would falsify them. Building on Kukla's suggestion that at the core of the function of ideology lies the misrecognition of a norm for correctly perceiving, thinking, and acting as always already binding, thereby concealing the fact that it would not be valid independently of its enactment in corresponding normative attitudes. It is further argued that this way of construing normativity can throw light on the phenomenon of ideology. From this point of view, ideology in its most general form consists in construing our fundamental life world categories as representational, that is, as cutting nature and society at its categorial joints. Moreover, I suggest that, in line with my general fractured immanent model of ourselves in the world, hyperstitional dynamics is best seen as bifurcated in a non-conceptual and conceptual dimension. Non-conceptual level hyperstitional dynamics can be understood in terms of predictive processing. See Clark. According to predictive processing, the brain is continually engaged in formulating predictions or hypotheses called generative models about the causes of its sensory inputs, and in testing these predictions against incoming streams of sensory signals, thereby shaping perceptual content, guiding action, and driving learning. Whereas conceptual level hyperstitional dynamics can be construed in terms of Brandam's neo-Hegelian model of content determination and conceptual change, see Brandam and Christias. Lastly, It is argued that the notion of hyperstition can also be an essential component in providing an illuminating empirical explanation of currently much discussed phenomena as the proliferation of sealed-off echo chamber communities and increasingly causal impact of fake news. In chapters 9 and 10, I develop some important ethico-political implications of a fractured immanent account of ourselves in the world. Chapter 9 argues that freedom is also expressed in a fractured form, as normative freedom, that is, freedom as self-determination, with Kant, Sellers, and Brandom as its main representatives, and as non-normative freedom, that is, as an increase of the power to act as opposed to the power to dominate, the main representatives here being Spinoza and Deleuze. It is suggested that freedom as self-determination has as its regulative ideal the emancipation from whatever hinders the exercise of our individual and collective epistemic and practical capacities, the ensuing expansion of our capacity for perception, thought, and action, and the creation of novel desires, interests, and purposes that go hand in hand with this expansion. Freedom as an increase of the power to act points toward a maximization of our collective conatus. Normative freedom and non-normative freedom are intimately related in that the former is epistemically and practically necessary for achieving the latter, while the latter is the ultimate raison d'etre of the former. In this connection, I suggest that the well-known link emphasized by German idealism between freedom and reason, epitomized in Brandom's conception of freedom as constraint by norms, expresses a profound truth, albeit only in connection with a non-metaphysical, normative, and critical rendering of the universal particular dialectic in our reason-giving practices. Specifically, building on Cernacek and Williams and Christias, I propose that the surplus ideal of universals, stripped of its metaphysical connotations and understood in normative and practical terms, can be thought of as an indispensable subversive tool of immanent critique of the existing semantic status quo. From this point of view, universals are understood as projections of emancipatory ideals regarding our collective epistemic and general welfare that function as an axis for coordinating collective projects in the direction of fulfilling these ideals. Building on the above discussion, Chapter 10 starts by noting that our normative freedom and non-normative freedom prescribe divergent regulative ideals that cannot be algorithmically synthesized at the level of collective ethico-political theory and practice. The regulative ideal at the heart of our conception of normative freedom is expressed by the universalist impulse for collective, semantic, epistemic, moral self-mastery, while the regulative ideal of our non-normative conception of freedom is expressed by the particularist impulse for unhinged monadic material empowerment. It is suggested that in order to achieve an optimal balance between these regulative ideals, we must opt for what I call democratic Prometheanism. I examine the implications of this view on the issue of climate change. The democratic Prometheanist view, among other things, implies that humans are essentially normatively defined as persons and not as a distinct and hierarchically superior metaphysical category called humanity. From this point of view, humans as complex natural processes are ultimately conceived non-hierarchically as being in a mutually symbiotic relationship with the social and environmental niches to which they are intertwined. This change of focus comes with a higher sensitivity to the strong interdependence relations that exist between our form of life other living beings, and the environment, and this necessitates reconceiving Promethean freedom in terms of controlled interdependence. 1.2. Some terminological clarifications: immanence, conceptuality, process, nominalism, appearances, and the in itself. To avoid confusion, some terminological clarifications are in order. I begin with one of the most central concepts of this book, namely that of immanence. It is true that immanence is not the clearest concept one could use in the context of metaphysics, as it, along with its contrary, namely transcendence, is ambiguous and subject to many different and sometimes incommensurable interpretations. This is correct so far as it goes, but then, at this level of abstraction, the same goes for concepts such as naturalism and normativity. They are accordion words, the contraction and expansion of which can often lead to philosophical confusion. The main reason why I make extensive use of the concept of immanence in the book, despite its being an accordion word with all the dangers of confusion and equivocation which that entails, is that it is a succinct way of expressing a fundamental guiding principle of this book. The metaphysical principle is ultimately related to a version of the principle of sufficient reason, PSR, according to which, to fully account for a phenomenon, we have to understand why, not just that, it is the way it is. Based on PSR, we can argue for the unconditionality of being, nature, in the order of explanation. The ultimate unexplained explainer is being itself. All beings, natura naturata, are conditional upon the existence of being, natura naturans. This does not make the relation between being and beings transcendent, because beings are themselves immanent ways in which being morphogenetically expresses itself. It just emphasizes the fact that beings are perishable in a way that being is not. Being's existence is not conditional upon something else. Thus, the question, why is there something rather than nothing, does not make sense. Of course, this is not to say that the unconditionality of being is here understood as just a brute fact. It is not asserted just that it unconditionally exists, as this would be at odds with our contention that this view is an outcome of PSR. Rather, it amounts to the view that only if we construe being as unconditional and immanent to beings can we understand the self-differentiation of worldly becoming into conditionally existing beings. Further, our focus on being's immanence is a way of stressing the fact that the existence of worldly modes of being, with all their diverse and distinctive characteristics, inorganic beings, life, consciousness, thought, rationality, include the existence of being as a whole. It should not be understood, explained by appeals to transcendent structures such as Platonic ideas, Aristotelian forms, Augustinian adequatio rei et intellectuis, absolute space-time, or their transcendent correlates such as transcendental subject in Kant, the transcendental consciousness in Husserl, or the pre-reflective body-world correlation as in Merleau-Ponty, which in one way or another view as unconditional the relation between being and transcendental consciousness. But to the extent to which transcendental consciousness seems to be a privileged distinctive feature of a specific mode of being, namely the human way of being in the world, it seems that this kind of transcendental immanence raises something conditional, the existence of the mind-world transcendental correlation, to the status of the unconditional. And to the extent to which it allows for the existence of being outside the transcendental correlation, it ends up reinstating a spurious dualism, and hence a transcendent relation between humanity and nature. By contrast, from our point of view, immanence entails that humanity, in its way of relating to the world, is not a kingdom within a kingdom, Spinoza, endowed with a special causal ontological power or powers, e.g. free will, rationality, pre-understanding of being, which qualitatively transcend the powers of all other beings and can exert transcendent top-down causality upon the world. All qualitatively emergent structures of beings must be accounted for in such a way that the emergent powers in question are not conceived in an ontologically dualistic or epiphenomenalistic manner. This includes special transcendent powers that disclose in distinctive ways the world and ourselves. To the extent that they are emergent powers of world-making, they must be understood as immanent to non-correlational being if they are to avoid making the transcendental mind-world immanence itself unconditional or something that stands in a transcendent relation to unconditional being. Another important terminological clarification concerns the notoriously and frequently misunderstood Kantian distinction between the phenomenal world and the world as it is in itself. I shall make use of this distinction, but not in the Kantian sense in which the world as it is in itself is constitutively unknowable to us. I shall develop a position that is similar in spirit to Seller's view to the effect that conceptual articulation, both in our discourse about reasons and in discourse about worldly facts, is a feature of the phenomenal world, but not of the world as it is in itself, which lacks logical form and is best understood in processual terms. What I want to stress here is that, on my understanding of the terms, the phenomenal world, or the world of what we might call conceptual appearances, is no less real than the world as it is in itself. They are immanently connected and thus equally real, but they are explanatorily asymmetrical in that the world as it is in itself is the explanatory ground of the phenomenal world, and the existence of the latter depends on the existence of the former, but not vice versa. If there is a sense in which the phenomenal world is a world of appearances, it only involves our knowledge or understanding of it and not its very being as such. It turns out that the categorical character of outer sense, the external world standing over against the subject, and inner sense, the subject's bodily, sensory, and inner psychological states, as well as that of space, time, color, and extension, are more intimately related to our sentient nature and evolutionary history than we thought to be. But this does not abolish the reality of the latter. It just reconceives their categorical place in the scheme of things. Whenever I use this notorious, potentially confusing, but to my mind still philosophically useful Kantian distinction between the phenomenal world and the world as it is in itself, it's always meant as above. An equally important clarification in this connection is that, to my mind, the reality that grounds the phenomenal world of appearance does not do so in the sense of being its independent cause. This would make the phenomenal world in an important sense illusory and epiphenomenal, thus not deserving to be called a really existing world at all. The phenomenal world is a world of appearances in the sense that its true categorical character is not the one we thought it be. That is, its true categorical character does not match our manifest understanding of it in the context of our everyday life world. Thus understood, the sense in which the ordinary life world is phenomenal, or a world of appearances, is much the same as the sense in which the Freudian real meaning of the manifest content of a dream is revealed by its latent content. Obviously, no one would think that the psychoanalytically revealed latent content of the dream caused its manifest content. The dream, as far as its existence is concerned, is one and the same. What changes is its categorical understanding, its categorical place in the overall scheme of things. I contend that the same goes for the relation between ordinary life world and the process world. The latter reveals the latent categorical content of the former. It changes its categorical place in the world, but not its hidden cause, nor does it make it illusory or epiphenomenal. A note also is in order about the frequently used terms conceptual and non-conceptual throughout this work. The term non-conceptual is used as an essentially negative epistemological characterization, not as a negative ontological one. Moreover, contra McDowell, Brandom, and other adherents of Philosophia Perennis, to my mind, the term non-conceptual does not refer to a hierarchical lower, more primitive level of being or understanding on the basis of which our higher rational capacities are built as a superstructure. The view propounded in this book to the effect that the world as it is in itself has non-conceptual, non-logical, categorical form is essentially the rejection of the e.g. Hegelian, Aristotelian, McDowellian view that the world has logical or categorical structure. At most, the term non-conceptual points toward another non-logical, non-categorical structure, but does not positively characterize it. By this I do not mean that the non-conceptual denotes worldly processes or events that cannot, as a matter of principle, be captured by concepts. I take it that such a positive ontological characterization can be provided by a process metaphysics. And from this point of view, conceptual form can be said to be enveloped in non-conceptually yet positively characterized processes. I call the metaphysical framework presented in this work a process nominalist one, and I want to clarify how not to understand these terms. In developing a process metaphysics, as opposed to a metaphysics in which objects are treated as substances, I use the term process as a shorthand for a whole system or cluster of categories that aim to supersede a corresponding system of categories of the substance framework. Thus, the categorical difference between the process and the substance framework does not merely come down to the fact that in the latter, processes and events are derived from the fundamental category of objects, substances, undergoing change, whereas in the former, objects are abstractions of more fundamentally relatively stable processes. The substance framework is a holistically articulated system of categories and goes hand in hand with a specific conception of modal categories, in which, e.g., possibility, is understood roughly along the lines of Aristotelian potentiality, spatiotemporal categories, which view space and time as antecedently existing frames for individuating objects. Universals, kinds, properties, qualities, relations, necessary for understanding the nature or essence of particular objects, and fundamental logico-metaphysical concepts such as identity, difference, negation, which distinguish between compatible and incompatible combinations of the universals of the framework. In my understanding, the process framework is the expression of a rejection of the above categorical framework, not in a piecemeal fashion, but as a whole, and represents the conscious construction of successor post-objectual categories in all domains of interest, be it modal, spatiotemporal, logical, metaphysical categories. If we realize that the substance property framework is a tightly interconnected whole, we also see that a piecemeal rejection of it will involve tensions or inferential loose ends that will diminish the coherence of the resulting hybrid view. Thus, in my view, this framework can best be challenged by an articulation of another equally tightly interconnected whole built around different categories. As for the nominalist part of the process view of the world endorsed in this book, it must be emphasized that it is a non-traditional form of nominalism that, unlike classic empiricist nominalism, does not eliminate universals altogether, and thus does not hold that only particulars exist. Rather, it reconceives universals in their relation to concrete particles in a way that A, universals cease to be abstract or general entities, inhering or exemplified in particulars. B, universals do not stand in a relation to logical mediation, of logical mediation to concrete particulars, while particulars are not conceived as actual instances logically subsumed under universal essences. And C, the fact that the semantic content of universals goes beyond how universals are actually used to describe concrete particulars in the context of our everyday practices is fully acknowledged, yet stripped of its metaphysical connotations. This surplus, ideal dimension of universals is not understood as a metaphysically existing unrealized potential or essence, but as a way of representing, calibrating, and critically adjusting the structure of the inferential space of the universals in question, in accordance with projections about the epistemic and collective welfare conferred in our actual social practices of implementing particular instances of these universals. Thus, since this view does not attribute causal powers to abstract entities, universals, reconceived in the above manner, are not abstract entities representing metaphysically necessary facts, and strictly abides by the dictum that the abstract does not explain, but must itself be explained, from Whitehead. It is fully compatible with nominalism, yet it is obviously a non-traditional form of nominalism, since it does not eschew universals as such, but only the view that they exert causal influence on the actual world due to their being general essences, forms, kinds, ends, that is, potentialities that contain in abstract form the essential properties of a concrete individual, leaving to the actual world only the role of determining the individual's accidental properties. Importantly, our nominalist view makes room for two intertwined yet distinct non-traditional forms of hyperstitionally functioning universals, that of evolutionarily developed intensive multiplicities which structure becoming and ground the field of real possibilities, and secondly, normatively instituted universals that navigate and reshape this field through norm-governed projection in the context of our symbolic practices. These kinds of universals are not ontologically distinct. Normative universals are distinct ways of being intensive multiplicities, but differ in that non-normative intensive multiplicities do not ontologically depend on normatively existing ones, while the latter do ontologically depend on the former. Lastly, I want to say something about the unabashedly metaphysical orientation of the present work. I make a conscious effort to avoid metaphysical dogmatism, a risk every metaphysics sooner or later faces, by attempting to draw a post-Kantian, transcendentally informed metaphysical framework, which is itself put forward as fallible and as having an essentially self-correcting dimension. Indeed, especially in the case of a process metaphysics according to which the relation between mind and world is one of fractured immanence, one must be keenly aware that in order to be self-referentially consistent, this metaphysics must not view itself as finalized doctrine, but as a projected research program, not as a finished product, but as an ongoing self-correcting project in the course of which novel answers to our metaphysical questions open up yet further questions that cannot be antecedently anticipated and often delegitimize old questions. See Rescher. This has the important implication that a question cannot arise before its time has come. Certain questions cannot even be posed until others have already been resolved, because the resolution of the latter is presupposed in the very articulation of the former. I submit that this holds for all questions, including metaphysical ones. To believe otherwise is to think that the meanings of certain questions are static, certain, and transparent to the mind, independently of the vicissitudes of inquiry, a view that is committed to mythical givenness. Moreover, the rejection of givenness in this regard also implies that a philosophical system cannot be refuted on the basis of formal logic or direct observation, but only on broadly pragmatic criteria of explanatory coherence, scope, fertility, and relevance. From this point of view, a philosophical system is refuted when questions it seeks to answer are no longer asked, as in Sellers. In other words, when it becomes a degenerate research program, as in Lakatos. Be that as it may, I am aware that this work has little chance of succeeding in avoiding the dangers of dogmatism, or reifying abstractions, and of making metaphysical claims that seem vacuous, vague, or both. The reason for taking these risks is that I think that however transcendentally informed, no philosophical viewpoint can consistently avoid any reference to a view of the world and our place in it. This view, through transcendental reflection, can avoid dogmatism and the reification of our parochial means of representing the world into features of the world itself, but it cannot do this without minimally sketching a way of understanding the world and our place in it, which is to say, a metaphysical view. I thereby consider metaphysics as non-optional, and thus as the lesser evil compared to supposedly resolutely anti-metaphysical viewpoints. In particular, I take it that even those whose proclaim to avoid metaphysics altogether or leave room for only a negative metaphysics without any possible, even if very abstract, commitment as to how the world is at the level of being, or its relation to beings or to the mind, either succumb to one or another version of the myth of the given, or surreptitiously invoke metaphysical views that do not directly state. And even if they really and consistently do abstain from every such underlying metaphysical framework in articulating their philosophical views, I do not see how they can avoid ending up being skeptics whose fear of error turns out to be a fear of truth, as in Hegel. In any case, in view of the above, I think it is preferable to bite the bullet and directly attempt to engage with an epistemologically sophisticated metaphysics, trying to do one's best to delineate the framework that guides one's thinking and expose oneself to criticism, while hoping that even the shortcomings and downright falsehoods of one's metaphysical views will not be uninteresting, and will motivate others to do better, hopefully leading metaphysics to more insightful, fruitful, and creative directions in understanding ourselves and the world. End interest.